everybody. We want to welcome you to right there, Carbon Marine. And Joe Wilburn, he's been here, 18 years now, Joe?
Going on 18 years this October.
Yeah, and he does something that's, it's not an everyday thing because it's more of a specialized market. It's for the light tackle, the fly fishermen. When we're talking about, push poles and tiller handles and that kind of stuff. But Joe, you kind of made a good thing out of it. It took a little bit to get started, but you learned that it's really kind of a specialized market. It's a niche market. The guy with the big boat doesn't need a push pole, but although, some of them, even with a 22, 24-foot boat, it's not a bad thing to have sometimes to get you around.
That's right.
If you're fishing in a lot of shallow water, with a bay boat, for example. But we thought we'd come over here and spend a little bit of time with Joe and let him walk us through of some of the products that he has. It's a Tampa-based company. They ship all over the world, all over the United States. So you got yourself a nice little thing going here.
Yeah, I kind of fell into a honey hole with push poles. In the very beginning, I didn't have intentions of producing a push pole. And kind of going back to the early starts of Carbon Marine, had a customer that worked for Loop Tackle out of Sweden. And they had a fulfillment center here for their products they were selling in North America. And he bought a tiller extension similar to this one, and we got to small talking, and I was like, man, I really want to try to figure out how to make push poles. And he goes, well, figure out what you want and let us make it for you in our facilities. And at that point, they were in Korea. So that's how it all started. Loop would manufacture my original multi-piece sections, and then they would sell them to me, and then I would put them together and deliver them. And what I didn't know when I started was how vulnerable the marketplace was for somebody in the middle of the marketplace. Because what you got to remember, the majority of push poles sold in the world are sold from Charleston, South Carolina, to Pensacola, Florida, to Key West. I kind of call that my golden triangle, to use that term. And that a lot of push poles are in that area. Well, that just so happens to be an area that's readily serviceable by me with a vehicle. So I deliver. And that was my foot in. That was how I really got started building and selling push poles. Is I realized you have to build them, you have to assemble them, and you have to deliver them. You can't readily ship an assembled push pole. They're vulnerable to breaks and damage. And that was the big strategic advantage we had over our biggest competitor, which is Stiffy out of Corpus Christi. They make a great product, but they don't have a truck that delivers them to the center of the market, which is Florida, right? So I was able to kind of take market share from them, and then through some trials and tribulations, we figured out a few nuances about the business. And the second big breakthrough is just listening to the customer. People will call, say, hey, I'm new to push poling. I don't know what I don't know. I don't know what I need. And it might take me 15 minutes. It might take me 30 minutes to sit down and kind of go through a mental checklist of all of the elements and attributes that will steer the direction of which push pole is better for customer A, B, or C.
Now, I know that the misconception is from a lot of people is, oh, you got to have one solid piece push pole. When you and I were talking a little bit earlier, you were explaining to me why not to have a solid one long piece.
Yeah, exactly. So this is going to get a little deep in the weeds, but I think it's really important. There's been a lot of misinformation about push poles and how they should be made and what they should be made from. So in the very beginning, there was bamboo, then there's guys using wooden dowels, and then there's guys using aluminum, and there was a couple of years ago, there was a guy making some out of stainless steel, which I didn't understand. But the latest evolution is carbon fiber because it's stiff, it's light, and it's relatively durable.
But prior to carbon fiber, I guess fiberglass was how the basic pole.
Pull treated fiberglass tubing, which is heavy and not very stiff. It's very flexible, which is counterproductive when you get into the longer lengths because that length exacerbates that degree of flex in the pole. But what was the big breakthrough for Carbon Marine and for me, and this came from talking to Kevin Shaw at Stiffy, Gary Loomis, G. Loomis, he and I had a long conversation about multi-piece poles. Everybody, Scott, North American Advantage, I think, or Advantage was another one that's gone now. Everybody tried using multi-piece build methods to build multi-piece poles because, as I was telling you earlier, everything about building a push pole is exponentially compounding more expensive. So when you want to build something 24 foot long, your environment has to accommodate that. Your rolling desk, the way the pre-preg carbon is rolled onto the mandrel, has to be conducive to 24 foot. Everything goes up in cost because of the length. So if you want to produce a 24 foot push pole at a lower cost price point, you have to diminish those costs. You have to reduce those costs. And the fastest, most effective way to do that is to build the pole in small pieces up to a point, then assemble those pieces into a permanent, enduring structure. And that's where we hit the nail square on the head. Other companies did that. Other companies took shorter pieces and bonded them together. But what they didn't do well that led to this myth that you only want a one piece, they leaked. Multi-piece push poles in the early days, when Scott built them, when Stiffy built them, when Gary Loomis built them, the way that they bonded those poles together would cause fissions in the joints, and they would collect water. And then everybody would get upset because the push pole's heavy now, it's noisy now, it's got water in it. It wasn't good. So when we came along and we heard this feedback, we're like, hey, we got to keep the water out of the pole, right? Deliver the pole. That was core strategic advantage one. We could deliver the poles. I deliver the poles. And number two, you got to make them not leak. So the big breakthrough now, I think it's pretty common. We've had several Johnny-come-latelys come in and copy the methods and the materials we use, but we moved away from a lamination epoxy, which is strong but brittle. We moved to what's known in the industry as a rubberized epoxy. It's an epoxy that cures like an epoxy, so it can be in a wet environment, it can be in a dry environment, it can be in a humid environment. It cures no matter where it is, but when it cures, it has a degree of elongation, and all that elongation means a fancy word for flex. So now that joint could move and flex without developing a fission. A fission is just another fancy word for a crack. And contrary to popular belief, push poles can actually leak and not leak all at the same time. When you bend a push pole and it's got an inferior bond agent, it can open a crack, but then when that pole goes straight, that crack can close and seal, and that's why the water gets trapped. So when we move to elongated or rubberized epoxies, that problem went away. We don't have leaks. Our poles don't leak. And matter of fact, we are the only company that for the first 90 days of the ownership of a multi-piece pole, if it leaks, we'll warranty that because that's something we did wrong. Now, we can't warranty everything that happens to a push pole because I can tell you some stories about push poles that has nothing to do with what a push pole should be used for. But that was the second big breakthrough, is learning how to use the right bonding agent. So now we can, with confidence, and back that confidence up with an ironclad warranty, build a multi-piece pole that if I handed it to you blindfolded, and you used it, you cannot tell me that whether it's a multi-piece or a one-piece because it's stiff, it doesn't leak, it's light, and it's long. And those were the two real big breakthroughs for us when it comes to producing a push pole.
Well, now that you've said that, why don't we go take a look at one?
Yeah, sure, let's go.
And let's go in the back room and look at it.
So our flagship pole, the pole that we encourage or are happiest with, is our multi-piece G2LR. And this is a sample of the multi-piece G2LR section. The section's 8 foot long, all carbon fiber. The majority of the fibers are running down the zero axis, which means they're running this way. That's really important because when you're dealing with a long carbon fiber tube, in order to make that tube stiff, you want the fibers to run down the outside surface so that when that tube is flexed, those fibers are immediately taut. Taut means tight. So you're going to find that the push poles that have the highest degree of stiffness, or modulus in the technical terms, are poles that are made out of uni-carbon. The carbon is in one direction, not carbon that's braided. If you see a push pole that the carbon is braided like a bed sheet, up and down, that pole by its nature is not as stiff as any other push pole because those fibers have to get pulled straight So they're going over, under thousands of times down the length of the pole. So if you look at a push pole and it looks like traditional carbon fiber, where you can see the weaves going up and down, by its nature, that pole is not going to be stiff because of the type of fiber they used. So all of our fibers in our poles are uni-fiber. We put this little trace toe, this material is called toe. We put this trace toe as a break prevention. So if the pole does have an accident and gets broken, when those fibers that are on the outside that are running down start to splinter, they'll hit that and stop. So it prevents the over splintering if the pole gets broken.
So it's easier to repair.
Easier to repair. Well, you recover more of the pole. Now, having said that, this is our lowest price point. This is our Magnum tube, and if you notice, it's void of that spiral wrapping, and we did that to reduce cost. So we're trying to keep this pole uni, carbon fiber, but still at a very attractive price point. And then if you go up the pricing paradigm, if you go way up to the top of our pricing paradigm, you get our G3s, which are one piece, and that's a very, very expensive item to produce, and for a select group of people. Like,
Now you were showing me too the joints, your joints that you use, and your competitors.
yeah. So the tubes. A lot of people say, well, how do you build a multi-piece push pole? How do you get the pieces to go together? They screw together, they glue together, and the short answer is we use a ferrule. This is called a ferrule. It's just another type of tube, different diameter, that fits inside, right? And if you notice,
going to get epoxied in.
Yep, so we'll use that flexible epoxy I talked about, and we'll index this, or we'll sand it, so it's rough, and the epoxy can bind, and when we're done with that joint, it's going to look like this. And then the other side of that joint would come together like that. So that's what a finished Magnum joint would look like. You can barely see that, and you definitely have a hard time feeling it, right? It's even closer, the fit and finish on the G2 is even better because this edge is machined a little cleaner. But what you were wanting me to point out is the difference. Look at the difference in the wall thickness of those two ferrules. So this one, this ferrule is the carbon marine ferrule, heavy duty carbon marine ferrule, and this is a standard ferrule, which is the same ferrule that everybody else in our space, our competitors,
a lot thicker.
use. So you tell me which ferrule you'd rather have.
I mean, when I looked at it, it looked like a Schedule 40 to Schedule 80 PVC.
So yeah, so this is what the industry would consider to be a standard ferrule. We don't use this ferrule anymore. We use the double wall thickness ferrule. Now, some people say, well, if it's double the wall thickness, it's going to be a little bit heavier. And I say, yeah. So we talked about this off camera, but life is always about making choices, right? We make choices as adults, sometimes as not adults, that are, no matter what the choice is, it's going to have a positive and negative aspects of that decision. And one of the positive aspects about a multi-piece push pole, and this is going to kind of twist everybody's brain a little bit. Everybody wants the lightest push pole they can get because they think if the push pole is super, super light, I'm going to spend less energy using it. That's a misnomer because push poles are also hollow and they float. So if you're out in 10 foot of water with a 24-foot push pole, you're going to be tired. And why are you going to be tired? Because you're fighting the buoyancy, right? Go back to the old days when sailboats sailed, right? If they had an empty sailboat, the old sailboats that used to sail into Port Tampa to pick up cattle from lakes and take them back to Cuba, that's called ballast point because they'd fill the bottom of the boat with rocks to make the boat float right. Push poles are similar. You want a push pole that's got enough mass to counterbalance that buoyancy tendency because when you get to the last 3 or 4 feet of a 24-foot push pole, it's going to want to float and you're fighting it down. And all of a sudden, you get off the boat and you're tired. You don't know why. But it's because you haven't been walked through the physics of what's happened. And so by putting a double wall thickness ferrule in a 24-foot push pole, you're going to add an extra 5 or 6 ounces of weight, but it's going to take that buoyancy point, the point at which the pole is in the water and wants to float, and bring it down so the pole stays in contact so you spend less energy moving the boat forward because you're not fighting that buoyancy.
Now, the other thing too is, what about, there's all kind of talk about the points on these
Some of this stuff gets a little overly philosophical, but I kind of keep it simple. We got multiple different feet and tip configurations. I'm going to step out of the shop for just a second to grab. So these are the tips that we produce. And if you notice, they're a little dirty from the dust, but they're distinctly different, right? And why different? 80% of the people on the planet that use a push pole, this is the tip you want. It's built into the price. It's the lowest cost. It's relatively functional. It's got some radius on the tip. It's quieter, right? Always evaluate stuff with the T account. What's the positive? What's the minuses? It's cheaper. It's quieter. Those are the two positives. The negatives are if you're in very abrasive bottom, like around Quintana Roo in Mexico or the Bahamas, where there's a lot of shell and more lower keys. Nature's Coast, Homosassa, a lot of limestone, very craggy, rough. It'll wear this tip out. I've seen these tips 6 months in the Bahamas, and it comes back, it looks like a golf ball. Okay. Or it doesn't come back, I go there. It looks like a golf ball. So that's where this tip comes. So this is what we would call the stainless steel insert. This is 3/16 stainless, much denser than the Delron. This one is injection molded fiber-filled nylon. So fiber-filled nylon, injection molded, pretty soft. This is Delron, so we can machine it. We buy it in long rods, and we machine it. A Cuban machinist that does it for me. And then we machine this. This is threaded, so you can take this off. But now, this will bite. If you're in hard, slick bottom, like Bahia Honda, Oceanside.
I'm thinking about like Chesapeake.
Chesapeake, we got a lot of algae on the bottom, it's slippery. This will find a crack, and it'll wedge, and you can push forward. It'll also avoid abrasion because this part handles most of the contact. The drawback is you got to pay a little more for it. It is sharp. Mm-hmm. It's noisy because you've got all of the energy coming down, right? When you're planting the pole, sometimes we thrust it, right? And you'll hear a ding, and it's in the Keys, permit fishing, lights out. Every fish within 100 yards of you is gone.
How do you replace this? Because if you've got an epoxy in, how do you replace
You have to cut it off. So that's a great point that you brought up that a lot of people misunderstand. A lot of people think you can treat the tip of a push pole like the tip of a fishing rod. You can't. Most tips, the eye tip on the very end of a fishing rod is put on with hot glue, not epoxy. So you can heat that up with a lighter and pull it off. But a tip of a push pole, you can't. So because if you heat this up, you're going to destroy the push pole. So you cut 2.5 inches off and rebond it. So going back to the last tip, this is a very specialized tip. I developed this tip after struggling with the worm hatch off of Spanish Harbor down in the lower Keys north of Big Pine. We had tarpon eating a worm hatch, and the bottom was like asphalt with slime. So I was slipping, I was falling. So I went back, and the next day we went bone fishing, and then my pole kept getting wedged in little coral heads, and it ended up cracking the tube right above the tip. So right about here, it cracked and started leaking. So I was like, I want something heavier, sharper, and that extends the crushable portion of the pole away from the coral heads. So this tip is about 6 ounces heavier, so it adds ballast to the pole. So now if you're in 8-10 feet of water, you can let the pole rest on bottom because this is going to add enough weight that the pole naturally finds the bottom. It's going to grab, and it's going to keep, if this does end up in a coral head, you can spin the pole, break the friction loose, and pull it out. It's not likely to puncture the tubing. So this is mainly for lower Keys, some, Isla Morada South. This one is more general purpose, anywhere there's rock or rough or rocky, slippery bottom. And this is more if it's terra firma, muddy, sandy, kind of like West Coast, Mosquito Lagoon, the Everglades. This would probably be a better tip.
So your standard point.
Yeah, the nylon tip. Yep.
Okay.
Then when it comes to feet, this is probably the more classic shape. We've nicknamed this the wide bridge. It's wider slightly, and it's bridged. So this is a classic foot. This is what most people look for when they see a foot. That's what they're looking at. That's what they're used to seeing. Then we came out with this adaptation. These 2 feet come out of the exact same mold. The only difference is when we shoot this one, we drop a dam that blocks this area off. This is more like the classic Hells Bay logo. And the history behind this is back when people first started making push poles, there weren't any plastics. It was all wood. So they would make a foot out of out of manufactured wood, and the tines would break off because the grain wasn't working in the right direction. Then some shady guys out there, Flip Pallet and some of those guys, that's a joke, they would go find a branch of a
And
guava
make it out,
tree
yeah.
or a lignum vitae tree or a Brazilian pepper tree, and they would cut that out. And now Flip's kind of famous for carving wood feet.
Yeah, because I saw that. I saw that
Yeah.
video that Flip made.
Now the reason why I like the wood foot, there's a lot of good science behind using a wood foot, because what happens is the ends, we call it feathering or fuzzing. That wood will get soft and it'll get abraded and it'll get a soft, almost like a carpet texture. So it's really quiet. When it hits rock, it doesn't make a lot of sound. That doesn't happen with plastics. Plastics are loud, but you can't mass produce those feet
Right.
because they got to be grown. That
That's
grain's
right,
got to go
right.
the right way. Like I've tried, it's not easy to do. So this was kind of a throwback to the classic wood fork, but made out of fiber-filled nylon.
The one, your basic that comes with your,
All of these you can choose. It'll come
You
with
can
any of
choose.
them. But I would say the most popular is probably the bridge fork. This is very popular. Second would be the wide bridge, and third, this is more for traditionalists, guys that are kind of old school.
Yeah.
But the biggest advantage of these 2 feet over the open fork, and this is going to make you laugh, has nothing to do with how you use the pole. It has to do with being able to lock this thing up. I can't tell you how many times I got a phone call, hey, I stepped into my hotel room, I walked back out, and my 2 push poles are gone from my boat. People will steal push poles off your boat in a second. So this allows you to put a bicycle chain or a lock through it and lock it, as will this.
so they can't steal it.
And then there's another kind of a hidden advantage of this one. If you fish with a lot of guys like I fish with, some of them can cast really good, some of them not so good, and they throw their fly or their lure and it's hung up on just on the edge of the mangroves. You and I both know what happens when you go up into the mangroves.
Oh, yeah.
The no-see-ums, the mosquitoes,
It's gonna eat you
everything, you're going to get eaten alive. So with this foot, you can get kind of close and reach in there and grab the line and
pull it
sometimes
out.
be able to extract it. That's kind of a hidden secret, but that's why this foot's probably the most popular. Be able to lock it up. Its foot also bites a little better too in mud because the tines will kind of bite. Now some people say, well, you got that bar in there because it stops it from sinking into the mud.
And everybody, thanks again for watching. Stay tuned for the next one.